Qué gusto estar con ustedes de nuevo. Es hora de seguir estudiando y practicando el idioma español. Como primer paso en esta lección, voy a darles unas ideas para expandir su vocabulario. Y quiero hablar del tema de vocabulario porque es un aspecto fundamental de su capacidad de comunicarse. Si no tienen un repertorio amplio de palabras, no van a poder expresarse de manera adecuada. Y les aseguro, de mis años de experiencia con estudiantes en los primeros niveles de español, que el proceso de ampliar, de aumentar, de hacer más grande el vocabulario no es cuestión de un talento mágico. No, es más bien sobre todo una decisión consciente de empezar a incorporar nuevas palabras al comunicarse. Y dentro de poco les voy a ofrecer varias técnicas útiles que van a ayudarles a ampliar su vocabulario en español. And so ends my introduction to the lesson. Pero vamos a hacer mucho más en esta lección, así que voy a seguir hablando en español. Después de trabajar con el tema del vocabulario, vamos a entrar al mundo de la gramática. Primero, voy a hablar de una palabra muy útil en una variedad de contextos, sé. Y específicamente vamos a ver el sé impersonal y el sé pasivo, dos construcciones que se ven muy a menudo en español. Otro tema gramatical que vamos a analizar es el de los tiempos verbales progresivos. Vamos a repasar el presente progresivo y después les voy a enseñar el imperfecto progresivo. En cuanto a la cultura, les voy a contar un poco más sobre Don Quijote de la Mancha. As you surely know by this point in our second course, one of the constant challenges facing any language learner is that of acquiring new vocabulary. And let me talk for a moment about what I mean by the word acquire, keeping in mind that my principal goal throughout this course is for you to improve your ability to communicate in Spanish. It is nice to be able to recognize a word when you're listening to spoken Spanish or when you're reading. But it's much better when you actually use the word yourself when speaking or writing. That's what vocabulary acquisition really means. It has occurred, meaning you've acquired a new word when you use it. We've all seen the sign in the antique store that says, you break it, you buy it. My version of this for language students would relate to words instead of antiques, but the sentiment is quite similar. You use it, you acquire it. One way to think about the process of acquiring new vocabulary is the following. There are some words you recognize but don't use. You should work to begin using these words. And as you're doing that, you should be funneling new words that you previously did not know into the category of words you now at least recognize. With time, you should also be working to make those words ones you use in your active vocabulary as well. The latest edition of the dictionary published by the Real Academia Española, El Diccionario de la Lengua Española, has 93,000 words. But you don't need anywhere near that many words to communicate well in Spanish. So what's the right number? Well, there are different estimates of how many words someone actually needs to know in order to communicate well in the language. One study, for example, says that if you know the 2,000 most frequently used words in Spanish, you'll be able to understand over 92% of spoken Spanish. 2,000 words. Is that a lot? Well, in our two courses, the first Learning Spanish and this course, Learning Spanish 2, you're being introduced to a total of roughly 2,400 words. So, if you acquire them all, you'll be able to understand a great amount of the spoken Spanish you hear. Since my goal is to help you improve your communication skills as much as possible, I'm purposely including the most frequently used words in the language in these courses. Those are the words you'll find most useful and, by definition, the ones that are used the most. So what's my point in all of this? First, you need to expose yourself to new words so they can become, at the very least, words you recognize. Reading is very helpful in this regard because you encounter a wide range of vocabulary when reading. But the act of reading only provides input of new words. The second thing you need to do is both learn what the words mean and consciously work to include these new words into your active vocabulary by making them words you use when you communicate. So, I've just described the two necessary steps you need to take to strengthen your vocabulary. Step 1, keep the input of words, new words, coming. Step 2, make the effort to convert these new words into ones you actually use. So beyond reading, what other input should you be looking for? Well, this course offers input in a number of ways. Beyond the lectures, you're exposed to new words in the audio glossaries, the workbook, and the speaking activities. If you just watch the lectures, you're getting some input, but you're not using the new vocabulary very much. I've designed the other course components to require you to use these new words, which will ultimately help you acquire them. Other input beyond the course could come from intercambios, television programs you watch in Spanish, or what you hear in the language either on the radio or from the internet. As for using words, once you've encountered them, think of it this way. You're a painter, and the words you use are your colors. So if, for example, everything to you is either bueno or malo, you're painting in black and white. Why not experiment with other, new, more varied and vivid colors? Instead of saying that something's simply bueno, paint with words like admirable, fenomenal, extraordinario, excepcional. And why use malo when you can call something terrible, horrible, innecesario, absurdo? When you express yourself by speaking or writing, avoid the obvious word that first comes to your mind and try to use the more descriptive one, maybe one you've recently learned. Make your vocabulary a palette of many colors. Last point about acquiring new words. Lift up your hands like this. Now, move your fingers like this. Okay, good. Question. Did you need to drop your pen or pencil to wiggle your fingers? If so, great. If not, my question is, why didn't you have a pen or pencil in your hand? Here's where I'm going with this. It's not a bad idea when watching a lecture or a television show, for instance, to have a pen in your hand to write down some of the new words you come across. I never recommend this to total beginners because there are too many words they don't know, so they'd be trying to write too much and lose track of what's being said. But with more advanced students like you, this can be a useful technique. In my lectures, for instance, I'll include some new words, but not so many that you're overwhelmed by them. So here's another question for you. How well did you understand my introduction to this lesson when I was speaking Spanish? You may remember that I began this way. Qué gusto estar con ustedes de nuevo. Es hora de seguir estudiando y practicando el idioma español. Como primer paso en esta lección, etc., etc. Did you understand everything I said in my introduction? If so, admirable. If not, what specific new words did you hear but not understand? I'll wait while you consult the notebook in which you wrote down some of those new words that stumped you. If, by some chance, you didn't write down any new words, that's okay. But why don't you try that exercise right now? Go back to the beginning of the lesson and listen to my introduction in Spanish again. This time, write down some of the words you don't understand. Then, meet me back here and we'll continue together because I'm going to discuss the new words I used. So, you go back to the beginning of this lesson, I'll just wait here until you've watched the very first part of this lecture again. Welcome back, time traveler. I've just been waiting while you were writing down new words from the introduction. So let's look at the new Spanish words I used. Take a guess how many new words I said in my introduction. What do you think? Well, the answer is 20. I included 20 new words or expressions in that introduction. That might seem like a lot, but let's take a look at those words right now and see why it's not quite as difficult as it might seem to deal with 20 new vocabulary items coming at you in a minute or so. What you might realize, having heard these words and looking at them now, is that some of them, though new, aren't that difficult to understand. El gusto means pleasure, but we've seen mucho gusto, nice to meet you, before. So you might have used that knowledge to make sense of que gusto, what a pleasure. Clearly, there are also some cognates here, like el repertorio, adecuado, la experiencia. So, not all of these new words were challenging, especially given that you heard them in context. Okay, on to our second set of new words. As we saw with the first group of words, this list contains a number of cognates. Thank you, Spanish language, including el proceso, aumentar, which is a cognate with augment, el talento, mágico, la decisión. So, once again, these 10 words really aren't as formidable as you might think. Finally, técnica is kind of, sort of a cognate for technique, so you might have understood that as well. When you noted down the new vocabulary in your notebook, maybe you wrote the words asegurar, el nivel, ampliar, consciente. After the lesson, you could have looked in the new vocabulary section for Chapter 8 in the workbook and found the words there. If the new words in your notebook come from watching TV, for instance, when your show ends, you can go online to wordreference.com, which is my favorite online dictionary for Spanish, and look up the words there. Well done. I'll have more to say about vocabulary in future lessons, but for now, let's leave vocabulary behind and move on to grammar. I'd like to talk briefly now about the pronoun se, and I'll begin by pointing out that we've actually seen this quite useful little word in a number of contexts already. Se is used, for example, with reflexive verbs, reciprocal verbs, and as part of double object pronouns. How would you say, he gets up early? Se levanta temprano. That's a case of se being used as a reflexive pronoun with the reflexive verb levantarse. And how would you say, they see each other on Fridays? Se ven los viernes. There, se is being used as a reciprocal pronoun with the reciprocal verb verse. Now, with reference to los cuadernos, how would you say, Marta gave them to him? Marta se los dio. The se there is the indirect object pronoun to him, which changed from le to se before the direct object pronoun los. Beyond those three uses of this jack-of-all-trades pronoun, se is also used in passive and impersonal expressions. That's what I'd like to discuss right now. ¿Cómo se dice? How is it said? ¿Cómo se escribe? How is it written? Those are the kinds of uses of se that you'll see quite often in Spanish. Se, in cases like this, could be translated as one, you, or they, as in, how does one write this word? Or, how do you say something? Se dice que Sevilla es hermosa. Could be translated as, they say that Seville is lovely. In English, we'd ask a store clerk, where can you find the milk? In Spanish, you'd use the pronoun se and ask, ¿Dónde se encuentra la leche? And how would you use se to ask, how does one drive there? ¿Cómo se maneja allí? It's not uncommon to see a sign in a store window saying, aquí se habla español. Spanish is spoken here. Our verb here, habla, is singular because the subject, español, is singular. If I want to express, for example, books are sold here, that would be, se venden libros aquí, with venden in the plural because libros is a plural noun. Using se, the way to say, you see many colors, would be, se ven muchos colores. And to say, one lives well in Mexico, you'd say, se vive bien en México. Acabo de usar muchas palabras para hablar mucho de palabras. Y ahora voy a usar aún más palabras, pero vamos a cambiar de tema y hablar de las construcciones progresivas que describen una acción en progreso. En el primer curso estudiamos el presente progresivo, una construcción que vamos a repasar brevemente. Lo nuevo de esta sección va a ser la construcción que se llama el imperfecto progresivo, algo que se usa para describir una acción en progreso en el pasado. Primero, para hablar de una acción en el presente, obviamente puedo usar el tiempo verbal del presente. Pero si quiero enfatizar, es decir, dar énfasis, que la acción es algo que ocurre ahora mismo, en este momento, puedo usar una construcción que se llama el presente progresivo. Esta construcción tiene dos partes. Primero, el verbo estar en el presente y después el participio presente del verbo, que es la forma que termina en ando para los verbos que terminan en AR o yendo para los verbos que terminan en ER o IR. Ahora vamos a conjugar juntos el presente progresivo con el nuevo verbo aumentar. Hablen conmigo. Yo estoy aumentando. Tú estás aumentando. Usted está aumentando. Nosotros estamos aumentando. Vosotras estáis aumentando. Ellos están aumentando. The word for volume is the cognate repitan, el volumen. Let's say I can't hear the music, so I go to the stereo to do something about it. Just at that moment, someone asks me what I'm doing. My answer, which uses the present progressive, could be, estoy aumentando el volumen. It would also be possible here to say, estoy subiendo el volumen. So that's really nothing new for us. If I want to emphasize that I'm doing something right now, I use the present progressive. Ahora, por ejemplo, yo estoy enseñando la lección 8 y ustedes están escuchándome. There is just one tricky aspect of the present progressive, so it's worth spending a moment going over it. There are two kinds of verbs whose present participle has a spelling change. First, any ER or IR verb with a stem ending in a vowel has a present participle that ends in yendo with a Y. Examples of verbs like this include leer, leyendo, creer, creyendo, oír, oyendo, traer, trayendo. Second, stem-changing verbs that end in IR also have a stem change in their present participle. Verbs with a stem-changing O change it to U. Verbs with a stem-changing E change it to I. Verbs with these changes include morir, muriendo, pedir, pidiendo, servir, sirviendo. An example of a verb like this in action might be seen, for example, in an overly dramatic death scene in a bad movie. Watch this. No es posible. Estoy muriendo. Sí, estoy muriendo ahora mismo. ¡Ay! Well, it looks like I survived, at least outside of that terrible movie. So, time to carry on. The new grammar point I want to talk about is the following. The progressive construction can also be used with the imperfect tense to describe an ongoing action in the past. We know that the imperfect by itself can be used to describe an ongoing past action. This new construction, the imperfect progressive, simply emphasizes the ongoing nature of the past action being described. This new construction also uses a form of estar followed by the present participle. The only difference here is that estar is conjugated in the imperfect instead of the present. Let's conjugate the verb to stress, to emphasize, which is enfatizar, in the imperfect progressive. I'll give you the subject, you give me the form of the imperfect progressive. Yo estaba enfatizando. Tú. Estabas enfatizando. Él. Estaba enfatizando. Nosotros. Estábamos enfatizando. Vosotros. Estabais enfatizando. Ustedes. Estaban enfatizando. Muy bien. Use the imperfect progressive to say, the professor was emphasizing the importance of vocabulary when the class ended. El profesor estaba enfatizando la importancia del vocabulario cuando la clase terminó. And that, in fact, is how the imperfect progressive is typically used. Since it describes an ongoing past action, it's often used to talk about either simultaneous past actions, both in the imperfect, or, as is the case in the example we just saw, a past action in the imperfect that was interrupted by an action in the preterite. A case of simultaneous actions would be, estábamos trabajando mientras tú estabas pidiendo la comida. An interrupted action would be, ¿estaba durmiendo usted cuando lo llamé? Perdón. We know that the imperfect in general can be used to describe an action in progress. For example, if I say, yo leía, I'm saying that I was reading. If instead of yo leía, I say, yo estaba leyendo, I'm still saying I was reading, but my use of the imperfect progressive construction, as I've mentioned, adds some emphasis and highlights that I was in the process of reading. You'll be able to practice with the imperfect progressive in both the workbook and the speaking activities. There's just one more activity I'd like to do in this lesson. I'd like to tell you a story, and after I'm done, we can analyze why I'm using the preterite at some moments in my narration and the imperfect at other times. As I tell the story, the verbs I use that are conjugated in the preterite or the imperfect will appear on the screen. I'm doing this to help you become attuned to the times when these verb tenses are being used. And before I begin, I'd like to introduce you to the new words and expressions you'll encounter in my narration. In fact, why don't you repeat them? El libro de caballerías. El protagonista. Andante. El caballero andante. El molino. El molino de viento. Atacar. La batalla. So, those will be your new words in my narrative rendering. And now it's time for you to listen to the tale I'm about to tell you. Based on our new vocabulary, you probably have guessed what I'm going to talk about. Our story is a very simplified and abbreviated version of one of the first episodes of the most famous story ever told in Spanish, The Adventures of Don Quixote de la Mancha. I hope that Cervantes will forgive me. I bet you can guess the very first words of this story. Do you remember what they are? Here we go. En un lugar de la Mancha vivía un hombre que tenía casi 50 años. Se llamaba Alonso Quijano y pasaba casi todo su tiempo, desde la mañana hasta muy tarde en la noche, leyendo libros de caballerías que contaban historias fantásticas de caballeros andantes que siempre buscaban grandes aventuras. Por mucho leer y poco dormir, nuestro protagonista se volvió loco y un día decidió que él mismo era un caballero andante, como los héroes en sus libros favoritos. Se nombró a sí mismo Don Quijote de la Mancha. Inventó a una mujer que podía amar y le dio a ella el nombre de Dulcinea del Toboso. Cuando ya estaba preparado para buscar aventuras, Don Quijote habló con uno de sus vecinos que se llamaba Sancho Panza y le convenció de acompañarle y servirle de escudero. En su primera aventura con Sancho, nuestro caballero andante vio 30 o 40 molinos de viento en el campo. Aunque eran simplemente molinos de viento, a Don Quijote le parecían gigantes enormes. Le dio a su escudero que iba a atacar los gigantes. Pero Sancho primero le preguntó, ¿qué gigantes? Y después le explicó que no eran gigantes, sino simplemente molinos de viento. Don Quijote no quiso escuchar la explicación de su escudero, así que atacó un molino de viento creyendo que era gigante. Por la primera vez de muchas en la novela, Don Quijote perdió la batalla. Okay, so let's analyze the verbs now together. As is common in many stories, the scene is set and background information is given using the imperfect. He used to live, vivía, in La Mancha. We know that age in the past is always in the imperfect, so that explains tenía 50 años. He was called Alonso is a description in the past, not an event that happens. So llamaba is imperfect. It's the same for the books that recounted, contaban, adventures, and knights errant that always used to look for, buscaban, adventure. Buscaban, in fact, is a habitual past event, as was the pasaba casi todo su tiempo earlier, when he used to spend his time reading. So, this all contributes elements to the background of the story. But something has to happen here. And when it does, the preterite is used. One day, se volvió loco. He went crazy. He decided, decidió, that he was a knight. And that was is the verb form era in the imperfect because it's a description. Era un caballero andante. He was a knight errant. What else happened? Let's just look at the verbs in the preterite. He called himself, se nombró, Don Quixote, which recounts the moment he gave himself a new name. He invented a woman, inventó. He gave her a name, dio. He spoke to Sancho, his neighbor, habló. And he convinced him to be his squire, convenció. We see more preterite recounting actions that occur in our next paragraph. He saw the windmills. He said something to Sancho. And then Sancho both asked something and then explain something to Don Quixote, who no quiso, refused to listen. As our story reaches its conclusion, our knight-errant attacked the giants and lost the battle. Both actions were counted in the preterite. The other uses of the imperfect we haven't mentioned are describing things in the past, not recounting events. While he was a knight-errant, she was a woman he could love. They seemed to be giants. He was going to attack. And according to Sancho, they weren't giants at all. As is the case with vocabulary, reading provides valuable input in this case, and it can help you learn to use the preterite and imperfect correctly. Once you've read lots and lots of examples of these two tenses in action, it will be much easier for you to use the preterite and the imperfect correctly in the future. Gracias por escuchar mi breve historia sobre el famoso protagonista Don Quijote de la Mancha. Les aseguro que la versión original de Cervantes es mucho mejor. Hasta pronto.
Glosario en audio. Lección 8.
Give the Spanish for the following English words. Then repeat the Spanish word. Pleasure, taste.
El gusto.
Again.
De nuevo.
Step, pace, pass.
El paso.
Ability,
La capacidad.
repertoire.
El repertorio.
Wide, ample.
Amplio.
Adequate, suitable.
Adecuado.
To assure, to secure.
Asegurar.
Experience,
La experiencia.
level.
El nivel.
Process,
El proceso.
to increase, to enlarge.
Ampliar.
To increase,
Aumentar.
talent, skill.
El talento.
Magic,
Mágico.
rather.
Más bien.
Above all,
Sobre todo.
decision.
La decisión.
Conscious,
Consciente.
technique, skill.
La técnica.
Horrible,
Horrible.
absurd.
Absurdo.
Volume,
El volumen.
to stress, to emphasize.
Enfatizar.
Book of chivalry.
El libro de caballerías.
Protagonist,
El protagonista.
gentleman, knight.
El caballero.
Walking.
Andante.
Knight errant.
El caballero andante.
Mill.
El molino.
Windmill.
El molino de viento.
To attack.
Atacar.
Battle.
La batalla.
Version.
La versión.
Original.
Original. Actividades de conversación. Lección 8.
Give the Spanish for the following English words. Unnecessary.
Innecesario.
Ability.
La habilidad.
Process.
El proceso.
Experience.
La experiencia.
Talent. Skill.
El talento.
Protagonist.
El protagonista.
Adequate. Suitable.
Adecuado.
Decision.
La decisión.
Battle.
La batalla.
Absurd.
Absurdo.
To stress. To emphasize.
Enfatizar.
To increase.
Aumentar.
Windmill.
El molino de viento.
Conscious.
Consciente.
Listen to the following sentences and change them from the imperfect to the imperfect progressive. For example, dormía hasta que llegaste.
Estaba durmiendo hasta que llegaste.
Yo tomaba una copa de vino.
Yo estaba tomando una copa de vino.
Tú tomabas café con tus primos.
Tú estabas tomando café con tus primos.
Vosotros vivíais en Canadá.
Vosotros estabais viviendo en Canadá.
Yo leía libros de caballerías.
Yo estaba leyendo libros de caballerías.
Ustedes veían películas de terror.
Ustedes estaban viendo películas de terror.
Nosotros practicábamos muchos deportes.
Nosotros estábamos practicando muchos deportes.
Tú pedías ayuda para limpiar la casa.
Tú estabas pidiendo ayuda para limpiar la casa.
Ella se duchaba a las 6 de la mañana.
Ella se estaba duchando a las 6 de la mañana.
Change the following sentences from the present to the present progressive. For example, yo camino en el parque.
Yo estoy caminando en el parque.
Yo visito a mis hermanos.
Yo estoy visitando a mis hermanos.
Mis amigos y yo corremos 5 kilómetros.
Mis amigos y yo estamos corriendo 5 kilómetros.
Ella lee las noticias en su teléfono.
Ella está leyendo las noticias en su teléfono.
Él sirve la comida para los invitados.
Él está sirviendo la comida para los invitados.
Vosotros llegáis tarde al trabajo.
Vosotros estáis llegando tarde al trabajo.
Don Quijote ataca los molinos de viento.
Don Quijote está atacando los molinos de viento.
Tú dices la verdad.
Tú estás diciendo la verdad.
¿Tú construyes este edificio?
Tú estás construyendo este edificio.
Yo estudio español.
Yo estoy estudiando español.
¿Qué hace usted ahora?
¿Qué está haciendo usted ahora?
Listen to this adaptation of an episode from Don Quixote de la Mancha, and then answer the questions that follow. Cuando Don Quijote estaba cerca de los molinos de viento, no estaba nervioso, aunque los gigantes eran muy altos. Él estaba pensando en su amante, Dulcinea. Él necesitaba enviarle un mensaje a ella. Él quería decirle que la quería mucho y pensaba que los gigantes podían enviar este mensaje. Él estaba muy seguro de sus intenciones. Don Quijote iba a pedirles ese estupendo favor a los gigantes, pero si ellos no querían hacerlo, iban a tener una batalla. Claro, los gigantes no respondían nada a la petición de Don Quijote. Entonces empezó la batalla. Los gigantes estaban ganando la batalla y 2 horas después, Don Quijote decidió entregar él mismo el mensaje a Dulcinea. ¿Estaba nervioso Don Quijote?
No, Don Quijote no estaba nervioso.
¿Qué necesitaba enviar Don Quijote a Dulcinea?
Él necesitaba enviarle un mensaje.
En realidad, ¿quiénes eran los gigantes?
Los gigantes eran molinos de viento.
¿Quiénes estaban ganando la batalla?
Los gigantes estaban ganando la batalla.
¿Cuántas horas tardó la batalla?
La batalla tardó 2 horas.
Now, answer the following questions based on the story. Cierto for true and falso for false.
Don Quijote no estaba seguro de sus intenciones.
Falso. Don Quijote sí estaba seguro de sus intenciones.
Cuando Don Quijote estaba cerca de los molinos de viento, él estaba pensando en los gigantes.
Falso. Cuando Don Quijote estaba cerca de los molinos de viento, él estaba pensando en Dulcinea.
Los gigantes no respondían a la petición de Don Quijote.
Cierto.
Los gigantes iban a pedirle un favor a Don Quijote.
Falso. Don Quijote iba a pedirles un favor a los gigantes.